Hi class. Well, I'm kind of sad because this is my last video with algebra. The next 3 weeks you're going to be listening to Miss Bird's fantastic voice, and I'll be going to the 8th grade for 3 weeks. So here we go with the last video for this week, hearing my voice. It's Domain and Range Part 2. Let's lift up our tab called Set Notation, and we're going to talk about two options for doing set notation when you are writing your domain and range. Option 1 is to list every number in the domain and range inside the fancy brackets. That's like what we were doing when we were writing the domain and range from the different representations for relations, okay? Then there's option 2. Option 2 is inside of fancy brackets, you define a variable and describe the variable using algebra, which I know that doesn't make any sense, but we're fixing to show some examples here. So here are the examples of set notation. The first example is where we have the fancy brackets, and we are listing each number in the domain or range inside of it, separated by commas in numerical order with no numbers repeating. So this would be an example of option 1. Okay, now the next one reads x such that x is greater than 5 and x does not equal 8. We are describing the variable and defining it. We're defining it and then describing it using algebra. I got that backwards. So this is an example of option 2, and these will make more sense here in a little bit. The last one is also an example of option 2, and the way that you would read that is y such that y is greater than or equal to 7. Now lift up your algebraic notation tab, and when we write the domain and range with algebraic notation, we are using the equality and inequality symbols and variables to describe the domain and range. When we talk about equality symbols, these right here would be equality. When we are talking about inequality, these over here would be our inequality symbols. Okay, so this first symbol is equals. Then we have does not equal. Then under our inequality symbols, we have less than or equal to, greater than, and greater than or equal to. And now here are some examples of algebraic notation. When we just say x is greater than 5 and x does not equal 8. We could also do 0 is less than or equal to x is less than infinity. And then our third example, x is less than or equal to -3, or x is greater than or equal to 7. Let's explore how to find the domain and range when we are graphing. So, when we are talking about the domain, we are talking about the x-axis or our x-coordinates, right? So we have to look at our x-axis. And what we do is we find where we go, what's the highest point on our x-axis, and then where the lowest point is on our x-axis of our graph. And you see how I used a color to show that. Now, one thing that you need to understand is you notice how they have open circles. Open circles mean that it does not equal the 6 and it does not equal the -3. It can be greater than or less than, okay, but it cannot equal it. If these had been solid points at the 6 and the -3, then we would have used the less than or equal to and greater than or equal to. So now, when we look at this and we are talking about the domain, we're talking about the x coordinates or x variable, okay? So our lowest point that our graph goes on the x-axis is -3. So -3 is less than or equal to x is less than, I'm sorry, not equal to. I just told you. All right, x is less than x. I'm sorry, -3 is less than x because it has the open circle. And then it is also less than 6. And you say, what does that mean? That means any x value or in our coordinates for this line, all of our x values are going to be between -3 and +6. Now, if we do our range, we know that our range is our y coordinates. So we go to the highest point and go across our y-axis, and our lowest point and go across our y-axis. On our y-axis, we are crossing here at 5, and down here at -1. So if we're going to write our range, we're going to say -1, and again, since these are open circles, it's going to be is less than y, and then is less than 5. That means all of our y coordinates are going to be between -1 and 5 for the coordinates of each point on this graph. Now let's look at this graph that's on your foldable. If we are talking about, well, first again, let's remind ourselves that if it's an open circle, it's less than or greater than. If it's a filled in circle, we're going to be using less than or equal to or greater than or equal to. So here we first find our domain, which we know is our x-axis. So we need to find where it stops and starts on our x-axis. So it starts down here at -5. Since it's a filled in circle, we know that it's going to be -5 is less than or equal to x. And then on the higher end, we are at 3, so that's going to be, and it's an open circle, so that's going to be less than 3. So we're saying that the x coordinates for the points on this graph can equal -5, or they can be greater than -5, but they have to be less than 3. They cannot equal 3. Now let's look at our highest points and our lowest points on our graph to do our range. So where it's crossing the y-axis, our high point and our low point. So when we look here, we see that we have our high point at 2 and our low point at -1. Can it equal -1? Do we have one y coordinate that is at -1? Yes, we do. This coordinate down here is going to have a y coordinate of -1. Therefore, we're going to say -1 is less than or equal to y. And here it goes up as high as 2. That means that there's going to be a point there in the graph. So therefore, it's going to be less than or equal to 2. And so this would be our domain, and this would be our range. We know if it's our x in there, it's our domain. If it's our y, then it's our range. All right, now let's look at this graph. This graph is a little bit different. Remember that a filled-in circle means that it's less than or equal to or greater than or equal to. So if we look at our x-axis and find our lowest extreme and our highest extreme on the x-axis, What does this arrow indicate? That arrow indicates that it's going on and on and on forever. So do we know where it ends? No, we do not. Do we know the lowest extreme? Yes, we do. Our lowest extreme is at -4. So we know, and it's a filled in circle, so we know it's going to be less than or equal to. And that's our x because we're doing our domain. And then it's going to be less than or equal to, since it goes on forever, what's it going to be? It's going to be infinity. Okay, now if we want to do our range, we know that it starts down here. Do we know how high it's going to get? No, we do not. So therefore, we know that it goes on our y-axis at 2, and that's going to be less than or equal to y is less than or equal to, and then again it's going to be infinity. Okay, we're going to practice some more of this in class tomorrow. Sometimes what helps, instead of drawing lines, is putting sticky notes at all your borders to taper it off, show where it stops and starts in each direction. So we'll practice this some more tomorrow in class.